Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor Cato, for an extremely interesting presentation, developing the arguments of your classic book and an absolute landmark work in the area of the politics of taxation. And it's been very much an inspiration to me and to my colleagues, because we're actually developing a new research programme on the politics of taxation, which has not been subject to systematic political science analysis for quite some time. There's a dearth in the literature. Sociologists have started to work in economic sociology, fiscal sociology, but the underlying politics of the funding of the state, its composition and the implications for the capacity of the state to do things is rather underdeveloped in a systematic comparative framework. So there are several questions that we're raising. And this is an initiative that I'm taking with some colleagues, including Sebastian Delapiane Avellaneda, who's here today, from the University of Strathclyde, and Michelle Darcy from Trinity College Dublin, who's also here today. And together we're working with Professor Sven Steinmo from the European University Institute in Florence, asking a number of new questions, including these. What are the implications of states' capacity to raise taxation and to continue their commitment to the welfare state of the new era of taxation, the new era of austerity in which we find ourselves? Professor Cato has mentioned the new constraints on expenditures that have arisen since the 1980s. But particularly in the EU, since the global financial crisis, we seem to be entering a new phase of fiscal tightening with as yet unknown implications for our capacity to continue to fund the welfare state adequately. The tax regime itself can have distributive or progressive effects in its own right, and the way in which the tax system is structured, as we've just heard so eloquently, has huge implications for the ability of the state to maintain commitments to welfare. So the composition of tax and the distributive effects on different sections of the population have big implications for consent and for the capacity of the state to generate enough consent to fund enough tax increases to fund expansion of spending effort and sustaining the welfare state. We have heard a great deal about the possible limits to the tax state, partly from austerity, partly through demographic constraints, growing dependency rates, shrinking workforces, partly because of the forces of globalization themselves and tax competition internationally. We need to know more about how these work and whether there are in fact constraints on tax states that might force more convergence in future on low levels of tax effort. And finally, the issue of tax compliance. How do you actually design a good tax policy and implement it such that you can actually continue to generate the revenue and pull the revenue in? This is a matter of institutional design as well as of underlying political economy. And some of these questions are going to be considered by both Sebastian and Michelle in the next session, along with our Japanese colleague who will be speaking in the next session too. But the topic that I want to say something about today is this last one of tax compliance and tax administration. And this is an emergent research project. I'm simply raising some questions. I don't have a finished set of findings of the sort that Professor Cato so eloquently and elegantly outlined for us from her own research. This is rather an indication of the kind of new research programme on which we're starting work. And the trigger for this is a joint session of the ECPR, the principal European professional body for political scientists. And I'll be leading one of the joint sessions in Warsaw in spring next year, along with Dr. Delapiane Avellaneda and Professor Steinmo. So what I want to talk about today, just to give you an overview, is this idea that the fiscal capacity of the state, the ability of the state to raise enough money to do things, depends upon a number of things. It depends on the political capacity, meaning the political will, the partisanship, and the support that it has in the electorate. It's a matter also of policy design, but it's also a matter of citizen compliance, which we must never forget, with the generation of sufficient consent that can't be taken for granted. So underpinning all this is a further theme which is rather understudied, underdeveloped in a lot of this literature, which is the design of the administrative regime itself, the policy of revenue collection. And it's rather serendipitous that we're holding this conference here on the same campus, as it were, as the Irish Revenue Commissioners, whose head office is just more or less around the corner here on the grounds of Dublin Castle. So absolutely central to a lot of the findings, a lot of the literature that we see on consent, generating consent and the willingness of people to pay tax, is the idea of fairness. And the fairness that will lead people to be willing to pay tax depends to a considerable degree on their perception that the state is acting in an impartial rather than an arbitrary or selective manner. And so underpinning that is the idea of the social contract, which I want to say a little more about. And then finally, I want to just come back to this theme about the interaction between the way the tax system works and the way the citizens behave. There is a feedback loop. If the whole system is perceived as corrupt, if you have low tax efficiency and effectiveness, then citizen compliance will be low. So the big questions really have to do with path dependency. Again, inspired by the sort of questions that Professor Cato raised. If a country has continued on a certain pathway, a certain way of doing things, a certain way of raising taxes, a certain way of collecting taxes, and it is actually suboptimal, is there a way of breaking out of that sort of trajectory? In other words, what does it take to redesign your institutions so that they work better? Are we condemned to continue in a path-dependent way with corrupt institutions, or is there some point of intervention that will actually fundamentally change things? And if not, why not? Where are the obstacles encountered? Okay. So first of all, just a quick model of taxation in democracies. The purposes of taxation are, of course, to raise revenue, as much revenue as possible, with as low a set of collection costs as possible. In other words, you want as few citizens to be evading their taxes, and you want as few tax revenue officials to be engaging in corruption, whether this corruption is taking bribes so as not to tax people who are able to pay, or doing favours for their friends to take them out of the tax net, or any other means of introducing some corrupt practices. So you can have either of two options. You can either force compliance, force people to pay their taxes. You can exercise coercion. You can go around and examine. You can insist on examining everybody's bank account, or insist that everybody has receipts for everything that they buy, and that they offset those against whatever tax allowances that they're claiming. And this is immensely burdensome, and has huge administrative costs associated with it. The second option is compliance through consent. If you can actually get people to voluntarily pay their taxes, then you don't have to spend as much money actually collecting the taxes. So obviously the challenge is to move from A to B, to have as little reliance as A as possible, and as much reliance on the second option of consent as possible. So we might model this idea in terms of a trust relationship, and authors such as Margaret Levy, Bo Rothstein and Rick Uslaner have been doing a lot about what it takes to induce citizens to comply with the tax code in force in their country. So we might think of the society looking something like this. We've got the government, we've got citizens who have this sort of relationship to the government, whereby they vote in democracies and give the government consent to aggregate power in its hands to do a whole range of things, including the imposition of taxation. Citizens are consenting to be taxed. So the downward side of the arrow goes like that. But in exchange for this extractive capacity of the state, citizens expect that something else will follow, that there'll be a flow of goods and services, that their tax will not simply be squirreled away into Swiss bank accounts. They will really only consent to this in democracies if they believe that the money is being used for some common good purposes. Hence the idea of the social contract, the exchange of revenues for goods and services that are being used for some sort of common good purposes. So people buy into the idea that that not only issues of security, not only issues of road building and city lighting, but also the sorts of social welfare goods and services that Professor Kata has been telling us about, income transfers, health services, education, old age security, and so on. So it's a two-way street, right? So we need arrows on both ends of this story, on both ends of this relationship. But what we have then is a challenge of compliance. How is this going to work, and how are we going to make sure that everybody is part of this relationship? Are they all buying into the social contract? Well, not necessarily, of course. We can have the erosion of participation in the social contract for a variety of reasons. For example, it's not a stable thing. It's got to be secured and resecured. For example, it might disappear, for example, if for, say, some areas of the service economy, personal services can disappear out of the tax net if people, for example, feel the tax rates are too high. They may be unwilling to comply. We all know the phenomenon of cash services and transactions that then become invisible to the tax collector. We really want as many of those to be visible to the revenue collection system as possible. At the top end of the income distribution, in fact, we might find wealthy people evading tax, getting out of the tax net through legal or illegal means. And this is a very common phenomenon in developing countries where people, actually wealthy people, the elite, can often feel that they're actually not part of the social contract at all. They're buying their own private education, they're buying private health services, they're even buying their own security in the form of gated communities and private security services, and they feel, well, why should I pay to the state when I'm not getting anything back? But it's not just in developing countries or immature democracies that we see this. We see this in the US, for example, where a highly targeted welfare state means that elites or wealthy people feel that they have no purchase on, no commitment to the social contract. They feel, why should I pay taxes so that they, the poor, get the money? And so this lends itself to the neoliberal discourse whereby whatever money I have is my own, a very individualised discourse rather than a social contract discourse whereby the wealth that's generated depends on a set of collective resources and a set of economic relationships and contractual and mutualised relationships in which everybody has a stake. So this sort of individualised conception of the social contract lends itself to a redefinition of the tax relationship in terms of tax burden. It was Sebastian who was pointing this out to me the other day. The discourse that we find from the OECD, for example, is always about tax burden rather than the tax relationship or the social contract. And this is not a politically neutral way of describing tax responsibilities and taxation in democracies. So the challenge then, so you end up with a very thin tax base, where the middle classes, we might say, who find it very difficult to escape the scrutiny of the tax collector, feel ever more resentful and ever less willing then to comply. So what we want is a positive relationship. We want everybody to buy in and we want everybody consenting. So the challenge becomes one of voluntary compliance. So there's a missing set of linkages in this sort of relationship. And this is the expectations that citizens have of one another. It's not just the expectations they have arising from the nature of the social contract between each individual and the state. And I owe this sort of conceptualisation to the PhD research of Michelle Darcy, who did her PhD in UCD. On sub-Saharan African politics, fiscal politics, and was using a model like this, which is, I think, is very nice, about mutual citizen expectations and obligations. Citizens need to know that other citizens are doing their fair share before they will agree to pay their tax burden. Otherwise, why would you? If everybody else is not paying or evading or engaging in corrupt practices, then you'd be a sucker to be tax compliant. Everybody needs to know that the state is treating different categories of citizens equally, and that they are not being taken for patsies by the state, while other people, while the elites, for example, are escaping scot-free. So the implication then is that we need to consider what it takes to generate consent, what it is to generate the legitimacy, the legitimation of the tax state. And this is, again, from the work of people in the Quality of Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg, where Michelle did her postdoctoral research. So what's going on there? How do we explain this? What sort of politics underlies voluntary consent? Well, we know that this is something about good policy design. You cannot have fat cats, as it were, who are evading the tax net and rolling around in their riches while everybody else is being obliged to be tax compliant. Everybody has to be in the tax net. Similarly, you need good institutional design. You cannot have the rules being bypassed through corrupt relationships and practices and bribery and so on, that sort of people will escape the tax net. So the principles of good tax policy and the principles of good tax administration are more or less well known now. There's a lot of literature on this and what makes for good tax policy. It's basically not this, it's not a whole lot of red tape. We need a clear rationale. Taxes need to be clear in the statement of what they're trying to achieve. It's got to be clear how they're being collected. It's got to be non-arbitrary. It's got to be easy to comply with. The Greek tax system, until quite recently, has required people to collect receipts for everything they spend, which they then were supposed to bring along to justify their tax-free allowances. And the reason for this was to force people to get receipts to pull in the retail sector into the tax net. This is an incredibly cumbersome way of generating compliance of most citizens with income tax claims, income tax allowance claims, and an incredibly inefficient way of getting the retail sector into the tax net. So it's got to be really easy to comply with. And it's got to be not expensive to run. And these are principles that are by now well set out, and the tax reform initiatives over the last 30 years have set out these very clearly. Now, there is lots of political choice about how you do this. There's lots of sources of taxation you can tap. And Professor Cato has shown us that countries have made different political choices about how much they rely on different elements of taxation. Each of those has consequences for then the political consent that you can expect over time. Similarly, there are lots of different rules that can be employed to favour different categories of the population with tax benefits in order to achieve certain sorts of social purposes. But we're coming to know more and more about the downsides of certain sort of using tax exemptions or using the tax system to encourage or incentivise certain sorts of behaviour. You may end up with a tax regime that has too many holes in it, and I think this is very much the experience of Ireland. By allowing lots of exemptions in the income tax system to people on low pay, for example, for certain sorts of benefits like health, to incentivise people to take out private health insurance, to promote and encourage private savings in the form of taxation of pensions savings, you end up with an income tax system that is full of holes, and when the downturn comes, then you're left with inadequate tax revenue. So there are dangers associated with different kinds of tax instruments, and this is something we need to know more about as well. Why countries adopt different sorts of choices. When we're looking at tax administration, smart compliance strategy is surely to be encouraged, right? And we know some of the themes that are in general recommended. We know that, for example, you need tough enforcement. You need an effective implementation strategy. People need to know that if they don't comply, that they will be caught. But you mustn't rely solely on coercion for the reasons I mentioned. Your principal strategy should not be coercion. Your principal strategy should be consent. It should be the construction and development of normative compliance, a norm of compliance with the tax regime. So voluntary compliance backed by effective sanctions is what the desirable objective is. And so we might think in terms of a compliance pyramid or triangle, and I've borrowed this from I've learned about this from my colleague Professor Colin Scott in UCD, who talks about the regulatory pyramid, where we build upwards from an expectation that the largest number of people we would hope to have them exercising voluntary compliance. Then you can engage in auditing and monitoring in a much more selective basis. And when people become aware that there is actually effective auditing and monitoring going on, it incentivises people at the lowest section of the pyramid to comply more effectively. And at the top end of the pyramid, then, you can have the really serious sanctions. You can engage in prosecution, you can have name and shame activities, and you can take people to jail, you can implement their fines, you can do whatever it takes to really make an example of some people, pour encourager les autres, the better to encourage people lower down the regulatory pyramid to know that they will be found out, as it were. Okay, so what does it take then if your tax administration is suboptimal, if sadly you are not fully in line with the sort of model that I've described here? Now, it is of course very difficult to change your tax administration regime while you're already trying to collect taxes. It's like repairing a ship while at sea. You can't just stop your tax regime, overhaul the entire administrative structure and try to make it work again a year later. You have to keep the whole thing going. So we know that it depends on effective leadership. We know that leaders must engage in effective team building. The members of the revenue system itself have to fully buy into this. I've had extensive discussions with an IMF team in Southeast Europe that's engaged in trying to build tax compliance systems, effective tax compliance systems in near neighbours who are about to join the EU or have just joined the EU, as in Croatia. And this is incredibly important, getting buy-in from the other officials as well, so that they stop engaging in dodgy and corrupt practices. Absolutely crucial to this is the construction of expertise and the recruitment of people on the basis of expertise, and using technology. Technology is your friend in this. So online resources and electronic compliance mechanisms can be incredibly effective. I have a colleague in Greece with whom I'm hoping to build a comparative Ireland-Greece study on reform of tax administration systems, and he's very excited about this. He says to me, yes, in Greece, new technology is the answer. They have great expectations and hopes that breaking through corrupt practices will be made much easier by shifting to e-compliance mechanisms. So the administration system has got to have autonomy in recruitment itself. It's got to recruit on the basis of meritocracy. It's got to break out from political control. There's got to be no possibility that the minister can ring up and say to the head of the tax service, look, my brother-in-law is in a spot of bother because the tax administrators have discovered that he's hiding, €5 million from the tax inspectors. Would you ever just get rid of that, please? And the head of the tax service says, I'm sorry, we can't do that. And the minister says, well, I understand you have 3 children who are at a very expensive fee-paying school. Do you want to keep your job or not? Or heavy hints to that effect. You cannot have political interference that will undermine the functional or operational autonomy of the tax system. Generating that, I think, is the biggest single challenge. The biggest enemies are indifference or compliance on the one hand, and lack of systematic follow-through on the other. It's one thing to generate reforms. It's something else entirely to make sure that they're fully implemented, especially if these are being done under pressure of, say, the external institutions coming in, the IMF coming in, saying you've got to roll out reforms, but actually actually all the local officials are rolling up these reforms and there's no local buy-in at all. So generating this and stably institutionalising it is the challenge. So what do our countries, what does this sort of thing look like in comparative perspective? Well, we have some odd sorts of inconsistencies. If you look at this, the general government revenues as a percentage of GDP, we've seen some of this from Professor Kato. This is OECD. So Japan and Ireland are at the low end of the tax collection profile cross-nationally. They have rather small tax states and rather small welfare states correspondingly. Sweden is right up there, as and we're going to be hearing more about Sweden from Michelle, which is why I particularly highlighted as being sort of a classic of generous welfare state. And Greece, that's supposed to be ringing Greece there, has a higher or a slightly larger welfare state than Ireland does, for example. But the size of the welfare state bears very little relationship to the degree of trust that people have in their state and the degree of voluntary compliance that we can see, insofar as you can actually find evidence of this. We see here, for example, that confidence in national government in Greece is very low. And perceptions of government corruption are very, very high. So it gathers a lot of tax, but people really don't have confidence in their tax state. Sweden has very high levels of confidence in their national government and very low perceptions of corruption. So they're at the other end of the spectrum. In the middle somewhere we have Ireland and we have Japan as well. Where's Japan here? With rather lower levels of confidence in national government, not so, but high, quite high perceptions of corruption. So again, Ireland and Japan are clustering somewhat similarly here. So Ireland is a sort of midway case between Greece and Sweden. Michelle is going to be asking us the question, can Ireland become Sweden? Or rather, she's going to be telling us why Ireland can never become Sweden. But my question is, can Greece become Ireland, really? Is there some way in which Greek levels of tax, perceptions of the fairness and lack of corruption in the tax system specifically can improve, at least to Irish levels. So the changes that took place in Ireland over the last 30 years have been very extensive. The Irish revenue system calls itself the most effective revenue gathering system in Europe, in the OECD. It has huge boasts. It's apparently a very good tax administration system. The system itself is perceived as effective and efficient and with very low levels of corruption. So we have a paradox. It's a rather low trust society, low trust in the state, low levels of confidence in the state, as I showed you, but a high compliance regime. So explaining this requires us to look at ideas. Around about 1988, a lot of reforms undertaken in Ireland, very much under the auspices of the international tax reform movement. The actors involved were a driving reforming government that took power in the late 1980s, determined to clean up a huge fiscal mess that it had inherited. And the revenue commissioners were given a lot of powers and took over a lot of powers to drive through a lot of these sorts of reforms. And what was involved then was a great deal of change in institutional design. They were already relatively incorrupt in the sense that they weren't being seriously undermined by the political system. They weren't being phoned up and heavied by politicians to an enormous degree. It wasn't a corrupt tax implementation system, but it became very, very much more effective and efficient. So the reforms, I think I can just go through very quickly, went from poor policy design and poor policy administration to a system whereby there were far stronger incentives but also much more effective sanctions. I know that the slides from these presentations are available outside, so I just want to go on fairly quickly if I may. So the effectiveness depended on having efficient online systems. This has been a huge change in the Irish tax regime. The shadow economy was reduced considerably, and the new and voluntary compliance was enormously improved, to the extent that introducing a quite significant new tax in the middle of the major economic downturn and a huge crisis in Ireland, which required a considerable increase in tax burdens, proved to be really very successful. Remarkably, over 80% of people signed up by the time the deadline kicked in of the new property tax. So how did the revenue do this? It did it through this combination of incentives, making it easy for people to buy in, norm building, telling people, oh, this already, 75% of people have already signed in, like 3 months in advance or something, making everybody believe, well, everybody else is doing it, I'd better do it, backed up by sanctions and punishments. And so I find it quite striking that Sinn Féin resisted the property tax. One of the main opposition parties in Ireland, one of whose most prominent politicians is Mary Lou MacDonald. And her party has opposed the property tax, but she said she was going to pay. Why? We were reminded that the revenue has enormous powers, but the story has Mary Lou MacDonald quoted as saying, obviously, as a citizen, I would always prefer to be fully tax compliant. I always play by the rules. We're registering and paying. So even the political party that was taking the lead in opposition to the new tax had as its most prominent spokesperson somebody who said that yes, she was going to be tax compliant. So this is a tremendous success on the part of the revenue commissioners themselves, I think. The cost of the Irish tax administration system is about average. It's around about the middle now of the overall distributions in the OECD, in the EU, as it happens. And this is Sweden with very low costs. But there are no data available for Greece. The black economy is lower than the average in the EU, according to the EU's own estimates. So the revenue commissioners think about 5% of income is not in the tax regime. The EU thinks it's about 12.7%. There are different measures for this. My key point really here is that it's pretty good. Even in Sweden, the black economy is there's a considerable amount of activity outside outside the formal economy, the taxable economy, and in Greece it's estimated at about a quarter of the size of the total economy. After the crisis, since we're being asked to think about fiscal politics after the crisis, this was we find that the whole tax system is very, very problematic. But at least the legitimacy of the tax regime is not fundamentally in question. Whereas in Greece, and this, of course, is a huge problem. People are resistant to paying more taxes because they know that the social contract is being breached, that the money is being used to pay down debt, to pay down the deficit. And how long people will remain compliant if they don't believe that the social contract is going to be renewed and restored and maintained as a consequence of their increased tax burden is a real issue. That's a real challenge. But just quite quickly, in Greece, let me just tell you that these are the questions that we want to ask. There's a lot of resistance to crisis-driven reform efforts to the tax system, to tax compliance. The perception is that tax reform is driven by external actors, by the Troika. It's not being driven, it's not something that has been taken into the ownership of the domestic politicians, even though large numbers of Greek people are very, very unhappy about the way their tax system works. We know that this is partly attributable to the fact that the political parties themselves are highly beholden to a whole range of selective interests. And dismantling corruption in the wider political system is a huge challenge. If you have a corrupt revenue system, it's embedded in corruption in the wider political system, and it's a question whether you can independently reform your tax collection without much more extensive changes to the institutional system. So the political control of state institutions continues to be essential to ensure electoral success, so the political parties have no real incentive to do this. And privileged social interests continue to maintain their interest in resisting tax compliance. So the questions, as I mentioned, are what is the link between tax policy and tax administration? Can you change tax administration independently? Can you break the institutional path dependence to generate reform from the tax system outwards? The tax administration system has very deep roots in the wider state fiscal capacity. We're going to hear shortly about the limits to the expansion of fiscal capacity for countries that are already on a particular sort of trajectory of tax collection. But the institutional aspect of corruption and reform seems to me to be one that's not quite the same sort of question. So can Greece become Ireland? And this is going to be the subject of some future research that I'll be undertaking. Thank you very much.